The federal government releases its annual budget on April 16th. There is a lot of pressure on the government to announce more help for Canadians struggling with the cost of living. But is there any fiscal room to do that? Kevin Page is the president of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa, and he joins me now. Kevin Page, always good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Good to be with you.
You've assessed the country's finances as not great, not bad. What does that mean for the public expectations going into this budget, do you think?
Yeah, it means we've taken on a lot of debt because of COVID and all those fiscal supports during COVID. So we've lost a lot of fiscal room. Those debt numbers, debt to GDP numbers, even the deficit is elevated right now. So that's the not so good part. I mean, the better part, I think, is the fact that still our numbers, and we hear this from the Deputy Prime Minister, Finance Minister Freeland, that we're still way better off on a relative basis. Our debt numbers, our budget balance numbers are way better than the U.S., way better than the EU.
So when people talk about the situation we're in, maybe in terms of it being on the verge of a crisis, how should we view that? Because we've heard business groups saying they need to cut spending, the debt servicing is getting too high, we got to invest in productivity. The Conservatives are saying, that they're going to fix this budget. How should we assess how precarious the finances are compared? Yeah,
there's absolutely no crisis in terms of like a public finance crisis. I think all those numbers that that people allude to. Again, it's elevated debt. I think if you look at the budgetary balance, we're talking about something around $40 billion in terms of a deficit, a percentage of GDP about 1.5. If you go back to the 80s, we ran deficits at 5-6 percentage points of GDP, not 1.5%. If you compare us with the United States, they're at 6.5% as a percentage of GDP. That would be like $170 billion in Canada. So I think, I don't think the deficit is out of whack. The interest costs are, again, they're about a little over 1%. Through the 80s, they were at 5-6% as percentage points of GDP. So we're still near record lows on interest as a percentage of GDP. So I think in terms of, again, we're AAA in terms of investment grade bonds and bills. So where's the crisis?
So on that, I mean, they are facing a bit of a political crisis. I think it's fair to say that when you look at where they are in terms of public opinion, this current government. And they've made some promises to deliver on things, but also made some promises to sort of move to this fiscal anchor and keeping, deficits to about 1% of GDP going forward and rein it in. Can they do that and deliver on things like pharmacare, move on housing? And we've seen the childcare program kind of having a failure to launch at the scale they were hoping, all of which might require more government money. Can they deliver on these things and keep that level of discipline they're promising?
Well, I think they can't deficit finance, large new structural programs, including pharmacare programs. They're going to have to find offsets. So if this budget is important strategically for them, I think they're going to have to find some fiscal room between now and the next election. I think to the critics' point is, the Liberals have increased spending significantly. In nominal dollar terms, as a percentage of GDP, about 2 full percentage points. That's like $60 billion higher as program spending relative to GDP. So that's a lot of spending, right. And there hasn't been a lot of constraint so far. So I think we'll have to wait and see.
So how do they do that now? Do that constraint at this stage in the life cycle of a government with an election 18 months away? I mean, you said find fiscal room. So that means cuts somewhere, right? Or tax hikes somewhere. How do they do that with the time they have in a way that is palatable and viable?
Yeah, I heard a U.S. commentator talk about the U.S. Democrats being good at addition but not subtraction. I think you could use the same reference to the Liberals. They're good at addition but not subtraction. I think how do they do that? They have to cut spending. And if you can, you can go, arithmetically, you can look at spending. They've grown the base of spending significantly, including just, operation costs, and so there's opportunities to find savings. They're going to have to cut to find room, to finance new programs.
Well, where are the areas where you think they could do that? Like, is there a soft spot in the size of the state, where they could start cutting things back?
Operations. Yeah, it's very swollen. If you look at, when they came into office, you look at the size of the wage bill or non-wage operating spending, and you look at just the growth of government. I think it's grown significantly. There's significant savings there in the billions of dollars, and I think that's one area they're going to have to find. Unfortunately, they've kind of already booked it. If you look at the fiscal planning framework, they're trying to hold that kind of spending constant. But it's still constant at a very high level.
So when you talk about operations, you talk about the size of the civil service, reducing the number of jobs in the civil service?
Yeah.
Any specific areas that you get? Because people would say, look, you need this for the service delivery, or you need this, to manage these programs. You need this to do whatever it is, the good things that government does. Where are the areas where you think they could target?
I think it's across the board. I think in this case, normally, having been a public servant for many years, when you hear politicians talk about across-the-board cuts, we don't like it.
Right.
But I think if you look at the growth, it's the growth is pretty, since 2015 by the Liberal government, it's been across the board.
There's about there's two budgets left potentially between the next election and who knows how a handful of interest rate decision points for the Bank of Canada. How much do you think what Tiff Macklem and the Board of Governors there may do on interest rate weighs into the decision-making process right now? How does Chrystia Freeland factor that into the decision she's making for the budget?
Well, I think in terms of the economy, in terms of short term, I think the Bank of Canada is the game changer. We need to get these interest rates down. There's an enormous amount of debt in the Canadian economy. Even on a relative basis, when we compare our economy with other economies, we're carrying a lot of debt at the household level relative to disposable income. If you look at like mortgage interest debt, we've never been this high before as a percentage of disposable income. So these, having 5-year conventional mortgage interest rates at 6.5%, this is really going to hurt a lot of families as we move into 2024. So it's the game changer. We need to get interest rates down, I think, to maintain a soft landing, I think, at this point. So, yeah, I think Minister Freeland is counting on this being probably a difficult year economically, slow growth, high interest rates, but a reduction of interest rates and then growth picking up in 2025 and then maybe a better electoral prospects.
So obviously she can't control, Chrystia Freeland cannot control what the Governor of the Bank of Canada does. So what does she need to do in terms of reining in the spending, anticipating there's going to be cuts in interest rates at some point this year? I mean, what's at risk for the government, for the economy, if they don't bring in this level of fiscal discipline that everyone is suggesting that they need?
Yeah, I think it's trust and credibility in terms of managing public finances. And I think, she's, Minister Freeland's added targets, for 2000 and this year, 24-25, trying to keep the deficit at $40 billion, as you've already alluded to, in the outer years, to get the deficit at, 1% or low as a percentage of GDP. She has to hit those targets. Otherwise, I think she'll lose credibility and trust.
Because they haven't really hit a target yet. I mean, there's reasons for that. The pandemic is a good reason. But there have been, outside of those years even, they've never sort of hit sort of modest deficits that were sort of the center of the 2015 campaign. And I just wonder, you talked about the AAA credit rating. Does hitting your targets factor into those assessments by the bond rating agencies, or is it just the bottom line measurables?
No, it's all of the above. I think so. Yes, they ran deficits higher than, say, $10 billion that they promised to in the post-2015 era. COVID completely changed the environment. I think if you look at the size of the deficit during COVID as a percentage of the economy and look at where we're at right now, nobody's brought the deficit down faster than Canada and sort of the G8 countries. So they've really unwound those supports. At a deficit at a little over 1%, 1 to 1.5 percentage point of GDP, it's like not a problem right now. But again, then the question is, what about the next shock, which we've heard from a lot of critics? And they're right. Like if we had a geopolitical crisis, another economic shock, a health shock, would we have the largesse to support the economy in the way we did in the last two crises? And I think the answer is we have less room.
But just as a final point, when you hear the criticism of the state of the finances and where the debt is and where the deficit is, when you look abroad, when you look globally, you actually believe this country's in a pretty good position at the national government level. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, abroad, when you look in a relative, when you compare Canada versus, say, the OECD countries, but also historically, even in a Canadian context, having kind of been in the Department of Finance in the 80s and 90s, these numbers are not, we're nowhere near fiscal crisis numbers. I mean, whether you look at debt or whether you look at deficits, or it's the cost of public interest charges.
Kevin Page, President of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Thanks for your time as always.
Good to be with you.